I'm at Koko Crater Botanical Gardens, known as a blooming volcanic crater. Oh my gosh, I found the cactus garden. I love this. It's like a page out of Dr. Seuss. You can't make up these shapes. This landscape was made for me. All the dopey, round, plump forms. They have so much personality. They're just these round forms similar to spheres, but so much personality. One of the reasons why I chose this particular view was because it really showed the slant of the hill that this cactus garden was on. Because of that slant, I was imagining as I was painting that these cacti were slowly dragging themselves up this hill so that the composition had this upward motion moving to the upper right-hand corner. I like that each cactus really had its own gesture. You wouldn't think this little fat blob would have much of a gesture, but I really did think about them as pointing in different directions. It really felt like there was a very plump one that was a little bit flat, seemed like he wasn't going anywhere. But it definitely felt like the very large one was on a mission, very determined to find its destination. These are plumeria flowers. They're all over Hawaii, and they have the most beautiful scent and refined form. I've seen a cactus like this before in a greenhouse, but this is the first time I've ever seen a whole cluster of them, and it was really fun for me to think about them as a group and what their dynamics were. The beginning of my process is always doing a very, very faint line sketch in watercolor. I don't typically use pencil. I feel like pencil interferes with the flow of the paint. I never really feel when I'm painting on site that I ever have as much time as I want to have establishing the essential structures of the underpainting. For that reason, I do think that my pacing, faster than I wanted it to be, did let some of the areas get a little bit muddier. Super floppy cactus. This cactus has major structural issues. Ugh, those are so nasty. They look like snakes. It's aloe vera? They look like they're writhing in pain. This is a barrel cactus. It's a really big challenge in terms of form and also texture. This is a really complex form because when it comes down to it, it really is basically a sphere, albeit a little bit misshapen. But then the form of the sphere gets subdivided because you have all of these ridges, which are pretty dramatic. But then on top of that, you have these cactus spikes, which are all over, and those are very much cosmetic. I noticed that at the top of the very large cactus, that there seemed to be this really dense cluster of spikes towards the top that then incrementally became more gradual as you got down to the bottom. I was also really conscious about the direction of the spikes, noticing how as you got to the bottom, the spikes seemed to move downwards. I really felt that this tree on the left-hand side was critical for contextualizing these cacti, but I kept it really unfinished looking. This tree on the left, it's barely there, extremely light in value, because I really wanted the emphasis to be on this massive weight that this large cactus had, and to have something as a contrast, which is so light and ethereal in terms of how it's visually portrayed, is a pretty good contrast for achieving that. That is seriously terrifying. Everything here is so bizarrely shaped, you can't make this stuff up. The ground that the cacti were on was just a mess of all these little bits and pieces. I tried to subdivide so that the lower right-hand corner had a little bit more of a terracotta color, and then things getting a little bit less saturated and more gray as they got closer to the cacti. It's a lot of scattered, really random strokes. I try to scan that area of the landscape, and I just pick out a couple spots that I think are points of emphasis, and then everything else is just totally random marks going in all different kinds of directions. I'm not really the most careful observer in that sense. I know a lot of people who probably would invest far more time and energy in terms of looking more carefully. But to me, the whole point of that area is that it's a mess. As long as we understand that it's a mess, it doesn't actually matter that much whether it is accurate to the image. I look at all the various parts of the composition and how they influence each other. And so if I have this really messy, chaotic ground, and then you have this really concrete, bulbous form of the cacti on top of it, that is a really nice contrast. So I'm always looking for ways that one thing can emphasize the physical properties of another. I am definitely in an evil forest with scary looking twisty trees. I've discovered that it is very helpful to have a tube of white gouache for some of those finicky little things like the little cactus spikes. Being here on site, of course, I didn't bring any white gouache with me, but I did pick up some white acrylic paint back on Kauai. But it's not a great choice. I don't feel like acrylic really mixes very well with watercolor the way that gouache does. But it was good enough. I definitely have plans later on to go back in with some marker and clean up some of the areas with the spikes. The painted spikes, I definitely overdid them. There are far too many of them, but the idea is to put down too many and then pick a few that you want to diminish. Maybe put a little bit of a brown glaze on top so they're present but not quite as prominent as some of the other ones. I confess that when I end the day, because my leg is being burned on the right-hand side, because the light has changed, I always feel a little disappointed in what I've done, because I look at it and all I can see is the stuff that I think could be better. There are some circumstances like this one where I do have plans to go back to shift up a couple areas, clean up some spots that I think got a little bit messy. And that's fine. You don't always have to finish something 100% on site for it to be a plein air piece. The important thing is that the bulk of the experience is done on site, and then it's really those fixes and little bells and whistles that you add later on that can be done in the context of a studio. This little cactus area is actually a part of a larger garden inside Koko Crater Botanical Gardens, which is this giant succulent garden. And I swear everything in here just looks really aggressive and monstrous. Everything has little spikes on it, or it's this aloe plant gone wrong with little ridges on the side. I've never seen cactus like this. It says on the sign that I saw as I entered the garden that in 1958, Koko Crater was set aside for development into a botanical garden. This botanical garden is just one piece of Koko Crater. Koko Crater was formed about 50,000 years ago during the last volcanic eruptions of Oahu. Technically, it's a tuff cone formed by an explosive eruption of ash.